I am going to be talking a little bit about some of my research, but I wanted to start off at the end, because I know I've only got 10 minutes and I don't want to get into Peter's bad books. So I wanted to start by talking about new directions. Where next? In 2011, the Society of Nautical Research put together a sort of centenary edition of the Mariner's Mirror, talking about naval history and where next. And one of the themes that came up again and again was the need for naval history to reach out and to broaden its horizons. The subject is seen as sort of being too inward-looking, too technologically focused. More technologically focused and inward-looking even than military history, which is saying something. And in particular, there's also a tendency from outside of the profession or of the discipline to see it as somehow either solely service-based or something that's done by hobbyists and sort of non-professionals. And I'm going to follow John and quote Andrew Lambert on a similar point. In his article in here, he said that the naval history is seen as eccentric, isolated subset of service education. And I think there's an element of truth in that. And if we want to engage with the history of the First World War more generally, and if we want to actually show and showcase the role that navies and the maritime sphere more generally had in the conflict, we need to reach out and engage with people, and that dialogue needs to be developed. And of course it needs to go both ways. They need to reach out and engage with us, in much the same way that John was talking about with military history and imperial history as well. So we still need to do this, but we also need to do this. We need to reach out to perhaps the ivory tower of academic history. And one of the issues is that people talk within naval circles a lot about kit and technology for obvious reasons. There's a lot of it. And a lot of this seems to look quite niche from the outside. And you don't get much more niche than what I talk about, which is mines. It is pretty niche. When you have to explain to somebody that no, your thesis is not about men digging holes in the ground, it is actually about something that goes bang in the sea, they generally ask the question of why, which is sort of fair enough. And in case you're wondering, yes, I do have a book out, so I thought I'd put a picture of it up anyway. But what I want to try and argue, and what I argue in here, is that this technology actually affects a lot further than we perhaps initially expect or initially see. And this is true of so much of naval history, particularly in this period. And so I'm going to go through a few examples, and then hopefully you can begin to see why I think the issues of law, war, and diplomacy are all intimately connected into this discussion of naval technology. And the first sort of case study I'm going to use is this one, which is the Declaration of London. Now, the Declaration of London was supposedly a set of rules for naval warfare, which was agreed in 1910 and was sort of ratified or finally agreed in 1911 and was rejected by the British Parliament. It never came into force. The Americans in 1914 thought that this should be the rules by which the war at sea was conducted, and they put a lot of pressure on the British and Germans to do so. Sir Edward Grey in the British Foreign Office turns around and says no. And this effectively is his rebuttal. He initially says it to Page, the American ambassador, in a private conversation, and this is his letter to Washington saying exactly that. But the reason he gives is interesting. He states that the Germans have sown mines in the North Sea, unanchored floating mines that will drift about, become as dangerous to neutral merchant ships as warships of belligerents. We must be able to defend ourselves, and effectively states that Britain is not abiding by the Declaration of London because of this illegal German behaviour, this illegal use of new technology, which broke with both the exact rules of warfare and the moral code of conduct through which war should be conducted. And I say this is important, and you're probably going to say, yeah, well, is it really that important? And And I would refer you to Sir Edward Grey's scrawled red pen on the side for who this draft is going to get shown to. The King, Mr. Churchill, Cabinet. You don't get a lot more influential in terms of British policy at this time. This is the 7th of August. They've got a few things to be worried about on the 7th of August 1914, but this is one of them. The second step I'm going to talk about is about the steps of closing the North Sea. Now, slowly but surely, Britain didn't merely militarily close down the maritime space around Northern Europe in the First World War. It also did so legally and diplomatically. And at various stages, you get increasing attempts to control movement through this space. And as I say, this is as much legal and diplomatic as it is actually military. And this is seen within the discourse as being very much part of the economic blockade. And it is discussed at some length in the diplomatic terms, particularly around Anglo-American relations and the breakdown of Britain's relations with the neutrals. But when you actually go back and you do the digging and you look into why this is taking place, why these decisions are made, this is a tool which is later used for economic warfare. But the primary motive for closing down the North Sea in the second part of 1914 is in fact to try and stop what the Admiralty believe is the widespread use of neutral vessels to lay mines in order to effectively ambush British vessels which were using the North Sea particularly, and the use of trawlers for this purpose and for intelligence gathering. This is the reason Jellicoe pushes for this. This is the reason Churchill sells it to the Cabinet. And it's the reason the Admiralty then sell it to the public more generally. And this gets accepted because it's seen that how the Germans are conducting the war at sea, particularly through mines at this stage. Remember, unrestricted submarine warfare has not been adopted yet. Mines are seen as a new, vile technology, and it's beyond the reasonable course of war. And then, of course, I've mentioned unrestricted submarine warfare, and we have to come on to it. This is adopted in early 1915, although it takes a little while for it to really begin to work through. But when the Germans first announced that this is going to happen, it raises some serious concerns, nowhere more so than in Washington. And the Americans decide that what they need to do is actually set some rules down for how maritime warfare is going to be conducted in order that they do not get dragged into this conflict, which is what ultimately Washington is really concerned about. Now, they try to effectively broker a set of concessions on both sides. And what's interesting is that the first point on this list of concessions that both sides have to agree with is the deployment of mines. The second point is, of course, the use of submarines to attack merchant vessels. But at this stage, still in February 1915, the mine threat is seen as the single most important concern and the biggest issue in this maritime space. And I haven't got a final slide, but as I have some time, seemingly, I'll end by talking about 1918, when the British begin to start considering whether or not they're going to have war crimes trials for German officers. And they have a committee which looks at this, and then they have a subcommittee which looks at naval affairs. And the first and main issue that they look at is, of course, unrestricted submarine warfare. And what you see in the discussions for this is how actually the acceptance or the acknowledgement of what is accepted behaviour at sea has changed. And what you are seeing is that technology is changing the legal parameters of what is allowed to happen at sea. Now, there is a secondary meeting of this committee which does look at issues of mine warfare. But by this stage, Britain, as James has already suggested, has adopted this technology on such a scale and such an extent that actually they can't really stand up and suggest that this is legal. What I'm trying to sort of point out here is that this technology is intimately connected with the discussions and debates around diplomacy, neutral rights, and the use of the sea more generally. And if we are to have these kind of discussions, and diplomatic historians have spilt a lot of ink on this, we need to bring the naval back into these discussions and go out and engage with these historians and work with them. Thank you.
Thank you.